One of the weird ones is they think they might have found the Ark of Noah. It looks like a boat, like it's the shape of a boat. It's in the place where they said that it rested.
There is a ridge in the far east of Turkey that most maps do not bother to name. No roads lead to it on purpose. No town claims it as a landmark. And yet for as long as anyone in that region can remember, people have walked up to its edge, looked down at the ground, and said the same strange thing to each other. That shape should not be there. Not a shape carved by a sculptor, not a shape built by an engineer standing over blueprints, but a shape that nature itself seems to have refused to make. A long, boat-like outline pressed into the hillside, as if something enormous had settled into the earth a very long time ago and simply never left. Today, a team of researchers walked away from that ridge with new readings, new soil samples, and an announcement carefully worded enough to make headlines without making promises. They are not saying they found Noah's Ark. They are saying they found something they cannot yet explain. And in a field where certainty usually arrives dressed as disappointment, that alone is enough to set the internet on fire. To understand why this particular hillside keeps pulling people back, you have to picture the landscape first. This is the province of Agri, in the shadow of the volcanic giant most of the world calls Mount Ararat. The specific formation everyone is talking about sits several miles south, on a lower ridge near the Turkish-Iranian border, in a spot so barren that farmers avoid it and shepherds only pass through. The ground is a mixture of hardened lava flow and old sediment, shaped over thousands of years by earthquakes, seasonal flooding, and the kind of slow geological grinding that turns mountains into rubble over deep time. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of terrain that produces strange shapes by accident. Nature is a chaotic sculptor. It is not, however, usually a symmetrical one. And that is where this story stops being ordinary. Seen from above, the formation looks less like a random outcrop and more like the silhouette of a hull. It runs roughly 515 feet in length, tapering to a point at one end and rounding out at the other, with a raised ridge running down its center like a keel. If you laid it next to the length of a modern naval vessel, it would not look out of place. That single detail is the reason this ridge has never been allowed to fade into obscurity. Aerial photographs first caught the shape decades ago, and every generation since has produced someone convinced that the outline is not a coincidence but a signature, the fingerprint of something built rather than something worn away. The renewed excitement did not begin with a new claim. It began with new tools. A multinational research group, blending geologists, remote sensing specialists, and a handful of biblical archaeology researchers, spent the last several field seasons running equipment across the site that simply did not exist for earlier generations of ark hunters. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, which reads how easily electrical currents pass through different underground materials. Portable seismographs capable of mapping subsurface density without a single shovel touching the soil. Where earlier explorers had guesswork, photographs, and faith, this team had instruments built to answer one narrow, testable question. Is there something under this ridge that behaves differently than the rock around it? The early results were unremarkable, which is usually how real fieldwork goes. Random noise, uneven density readings, nothing that screamed structure. But as the radar sweeps moved toward the center of the formation, the data started to change in a way that made the technicians stop and rerun their equipment, assuming a calibration error. Instead of the disordered scatter you would expect from broken volcanic rock, the radar returns began showing long, parallel bands, spaced at surprisingly regular intervals, sitting roughly 10 to 25 feet beneath the surface. Regularity, in geology, is a red flag in the best possible sense. Erosion does not usually produce evenly spaced parallel structures. Neither does volcanic cooling, at least not typically in this configuration. What the team found looked less like the chaotic layering of a lava flow and more like something with internal divisions. Compartments, if you want to use the loaded word. Or, if you prefer caution, regularly spaced density anomalies, which is the phrase that actually appears in the team's preliminary notes. Soil sampling followed. And this is where the story picked up real momentum. Researchers drilled small core samples from inside the outline and compared them against control samples taken from unrelated ground a short distance away. The comparison mattered enormously. because it is the only way to know whether something inside the formation is genuinely different, or whether the whole site is simply uniform bedrock that happens to look interesting from a plane. The results were not identical. Samples from inside the formation showed elevated levels of what soil scientists call organic residue markers, chemical traces consistent with decomposed plant or wood material, at concentrations higher than the surrounding volcanic soil. That does not prove the presence of an ancient ship. Organic material can accumulate underground for all sorts of mundane reasons, including ordinary plant decay, ancient wildfire ash, or long-buried vegetation swept in by floodwaters centuries ago. But it does rule out the simplest dismissive explanation, the one that says the entire formation is nothing but bare igneous rock with an unlucky silhouette. There is something organic down there. The disagreement is entirely about what put it there. Then there is the matter of the standing stones, which have haunted this region long before satellites or radar ever pointed at it. Scattered within walking distance of the formation are several enormous carved stones, some more than 10 feet tall, each with a large hole bored cleanly through the upper portion. Locals have called them different things across different generations, but the interpretation that keeps surviving popular retelling is that they functioned as anchor stones, heavy weights meant to be tied by rope and dragged behind a large vessel to slow or steady it. Whether that interpretation holds up under real archaeological scrutiny is a separate question, and it is one that mainstream researchers treat with real skepticism, since similarly shaped perforated stones show up across the region in contexts that have nothing to do with any flood narrative, including as boundary markers, tethering posts for livestock, or ceremonial standing stones tied to pre-Christian religious practice in the Armenian highlands. Still, their proximity to the formation has never stopped fueling speculation, and the research team's report acknowledges the stones without drawing any firm conclusion about their original purpose. What makes this current wave of attention different from every past flare-up is tone. The team leading the investigation has been almost aggressively careful in how it communicates its findings, and that caution is doing more to fuel public fascination than any bold claim ever could. In their published summary, the researchers describe the site using deliberately restrained language. They do not use the word arc. They use phrases like anomalous subsurface geometry and unresolved organic signature, the kind of hedged, technical vocabulary that scientists reach for specifically because they are not ready to make a claim they cannot defend. And yet, paradoxically, that restraint reads to much of the public as validation rather than caution. When trained scientists refuse to say it's just rock, people hear something closer to "we're not sure it isn't something else," and that gap between what was actually said and what people want to believe was said is exactly where a story like this grows. It helps to understand why this particular ridge became a magnet for this kind of attention in the first place, because the history stretches back further than most people realize. Aerial photographs of the formation first circulated internationally in the late 1950s, taken during a Turkish military mapping flight. The unusual symmetry of the shape caught the attention of an American engineer, who traveled to the site not long after, and became one of the first outsiders to publicly argue that the formation was the fossilized remains of a wooden vessel rather than a natural feature. His claims were mostly dismissed by professional geologists at the time, who pointed to a completely mundane explanation. The region sits atop old volcanic mudflows, and mudflows are notoriously good at creating elongated, boat-like outlines as they cool and settle unevenly, especially when combined with later erosion carving drainage channels along the edges of the harder material. That explanation, "it is a mudflow formation," has remained the dominant scientific position for decades, and it is still the position most geologists default to today. Nothing about the newer radar data outright overturns that theory. It simply complicates it, by showing that whatever sits under the surface is a little too orderly, a little too internally structured, for the mudflow explanation to feel completely satisfying to everyone examining it. The formation has also survived a long parade of embarrassing false alarms, and it is worth mentioning them honestly, because they explain why so many professional archaeologists roll their eyes reflexively whenever this site makes headlines again. In the 1980s, an amateur expedition announced they had recovered petrified wood fragments from directly beneath the formation, fragments that were later tested and found to be ordinary volcanic material with no biological origin at all. In the 2010s, a widely publicized expedition claimed to have entered a wooden chamber elsewhere on the mountain, footage that unraveled within days once outside observers noticed construction debris, mud and straw, and inconsistencies that suggested the discovery had been staged for cameras. Each of these episodes did real damage to the credibility of ARC research generally, and it is a large part of why professional archaeological institutions tend to avoid this topic entirely, treating it as a reputational hazard rather than a legitimate research question. The team behind the current investigation is keenly aware of that history, which is likely why their public statements read more like a cautious geology report than a triumphant announcement. So what, realistically, is the range of explanations on the table right now? On one end sits the position held by most professional geologists, which is that the formation is a natural feature, most likely a hardened flow of volcanic mud and debris that cooled into an elongated, boat-like shape purely through the physics of how such flows settle and erode. Under this explanation, the organic material in the soil comes from ordinary plant matter that has been slowly breaking down for centuries, and the parallel radar bands are the layered internal structure any mudflow develops as sediment settles in phases over time. This is not a dismissive theory born of stubbornness. Similar elongated mudflow formations have been documented in volcanic regions elsewhere in the world, and geologists studying this specific site have published papers over the decades arguing that every measurable feature of the formation is consistent with known volcanic and erosional processes. On the other end sits the far more speculative possibility that the site does contain the buried remains of an ancient wooden structure, whether or not that structure has any connection to the biblical narrative specifically. This is the interpretation favored by a smaller, more enthusiastic group of researchers and independent investigators, many of whom come to the question already convinced of the flood narrative's historical accuracy and are searching for physical confirmation of it. Their argument rests heavily on the internal regularity of the radar findings and the elevated organic content of the soil, both of which they argue would be unusual, though not impossible, for a purely natural mudflow. It is worth saying plainly that this interpretation currently lacks the kind of independent, peer-reviewed confirmation that would be needed to move it from hypothesis to accepted finding, and most archaeologists outside the immediate research team remain unconvinced. There is also a third position, quieter but increasingly common among historians who study flood traditions broadly rather than any single site. This view sidesteps the question of whether this specific ridge holds a specific ship, and instead asks a bigger question. Why does nearly every ancient culture on Earth carry some version of a catastrophic flood story? Mesopotamian tablets describe Utnapishtim building a vessel to survive a flood sent by the gods. Sanskrit texts describe Manu doing much the same. Greek mythology has Deucalion. Indigenous flood narratives appear across the Americas and the Pacific Islands, independently developed, structurally similar. Some researchers point to genuine, well-documented ancient flooding events, including the dramatic and scientifically supported flooding of the Black Sea Basin roughly 7,000 years ago,
as a plausible real-world seed for these shared cultural memories, arguing that a regional catastrophe severe enough to end a way of life for coastal communities could easily calcify into a mythic flood story passed down and exaggerated across dozens of generations and cultures. Under this view, the important discovery may not be a single ship at all, but evidence of the kinds of real ancient disasters that could explain why flood mythology is so universal in the first place. What almost never gets said clearly enough in coverage of this story is how normal scientific disagreement actually looks from the inside. It rarely resolves in a single dramatic reveal. It usually grinds forward through years of competing papers, repeated sampling, attempts at replication, and slow attrition of the weaker explanations. The current research team has been careful to say their work is ongoing, that further core samples are planned, and that any claim about the material's age or origin will require laboratory dating techniques that have not yet been completed publicly. Carbon dating of any organic material recovered would be the single most important next step, since it could at least establish whether the organic content is old enough to be relevant to any ancient flood tradition at all, or whether it is simply modern plant decay that has nothing to do with anything buried thousands of years ago. It is also worth pausing on why a story like this captures public attention so completely, regardless of what the eventual scientific verdict turns out to be. Flood narratives sit close to something almost universally human: the fear of losing everything at once, and the hope of surviving it anyway. A boat that carries life through catastrophe is not just a plot point in an ancient text. It is one of the oldest images of resilience that human storytelling has ever produced. When a ridge in a remote part of Turkey produces radar readings that even scientists admit they cannot fully explain, it does not just excite people who already believe the biblical account literally. It reaches people who have never read Genesis at all, because the underlying question is bigger than any single religious tradition. Did something enormous happen to human civilization once, long ago, severe enough that nearly every culture that survived it felt compelled to tell their descendants about it forever? None of this means the mystery is solved, and anyone telling you with total confidence that this ridge is definitely Noah's Ark is getting ahead of the evidence, just as anyone insisting it is definitely nothing more than an ordinary mudflow is doing the same thing in the opposite direction. What can be said honestly, based on what the research team has actually released, is this. There is a subsurface formation beneath that ridge with an internal structure that does not perfectly match what geologists would expect from a purely natural process. There is organic material in that soil that should not automatically be assumed to be ancient timber, but also should not be casually dismissed without further testing. And there are enough unresolved questions that a team of trained scientists working with modern equipment and clearly conscious of the field's embarrassing history of false alarms still chose to publish their findings rather than walk away and call it settled. Maybe the next round of drilling puts this to rest for good, revealing nothing more exotic than the slow-layered handiwork of an ancient volcanic mudflow, exactly as the skeptics have argued for decades. Maybe the dating results come back showing organic material old enough and unusual enough to reopen a debate that has simmered for more than 60 years. Either outcome would be a legitimate scientific result, and either one deserves to be reported honestly rather than sensationalized in either direction. What is certain, at least for now, is that a remote hillside in eastern Turkey has once again managed to do something remarkably rare in the modern world. It has made scientists, skeptics, and believers all lean toward the same patch of ground, asking the same unanswered question, for reasons that have very little to do with each other and everything to do with how badly human beings want to know where their oldest stories